morning at verses 23 to 29 here in Hebrews chapter 11 as we talk about faith milestones. There are those moments in life when faith literally is all that we have to pull us through. Those situations that are far greater than our resources, our ability to plow through. Those situations where faith alone is what makes the difference. Those moments, for example, when our bills far exceed our income and resources. Those moments when there is a problem at home that just appears absolutely hopeless. Those moments when stress is building and is built and we feel like we're going to explode and there's no relief in sight. Those moments when the dark clouds of despair descend upon us and it doesn't appear there's even a ray of hope in the midst of those circumstances. Those are moments when we can relate to the words of the Apostle Paul, who had his share of moments like that too. 2 Corinthians 1 verse 8, there's such a reality to what Paul said when he said, "We were completely overwhelmed beyond our strength, so that we even despaired of life." That sounds like a man who was in over his head. And he was. And you know, for us in those difficult moments when faith is all we had, we know it's not the end of the story. And out of those dark circumstances we have faced, we know that miraculously faith has sustained us. God has provided breakthroughs. And the Apostle Paul could say the same, because if I picked up the next two verses in 2 Corinthians 1, verses 9 and 10, Paul went on to say that we personally had a death sentence within ourselves so that we would not trust in ourselves. I like this. So that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. He has delivered us from such a terrible death, and He will deliver us. We have put our hope in Him that He will deliver us again. So he talked about hope, but we also see great faith, bedrock faith, in the midst of what he said. So on the wall of faith in Hebrews 11, we turn our attention to Moses. We take a look at his portrait as it hangs there. And it reminds us of a man whose life was benchmarked by several significant faith milestones. And so what we are reading will be those moments of faith that were great in Moses' life. So we look at verse 23, which really isn't so much about Moses, but his parents. It says, "By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict." So the story of Moses' faith starts out with a story of the faith of Moses' parents. I think they are the unsung heroes. Now, we know them by name elsewhere in Scripture, but they really are the unsung heroes of faith, inasmuch as their faith story is largely overshadowed by the faith story of their famous son. It says that they hid baby Moses for 3 months after he was born. Any parent who's watching, who's in this room, knows of the difficulty of trying to quietly hide a baby during the first 3 months of life. We know that babies cry a lot. Whenever they're hungry, whenever they need change, whenever they think they have a need, best way they can express that is by crying, and sometimes very loudly. On the other side of the spectrum, there are times when they are tremendously happy, and they express that by being quite loud as well. So try to picture the dilemma of Moses' parents. It was against the law for them to allow this little baby to live, because there was a rule, a law that had been passed. They wanted to kill off all these Egyptian boy babies. And so here they are trying to quiet for 3 months this little child. This beautiful child, as we are told. I like what Stephen says about him in Acts chapter 7, verse 20. That says, at this time Moses was born. And I like this part. He was beautiful in God's sight. So we just read that he was a beautiful child, but that's pretty descriptive. He was beautiful in God's sight. So the parents of Moses must have seen the great godly potential this child had. This was no ordinary child. They must have sensed something of his destiny. And they realized it was worth risking their lives to keep his life alive. And so they saw again that godly potential. They hid him against a government order. And I shudder to think what would have happened if they had simply complied what the government required of them. It says that they were not afraid of the king's decree. So by saving their son from death, we would say that they were guilty of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience. There's a fair bit of thinking and talking about civil disobedience these days. It's on the minds even of a lot of God's people. There have been some pretty clear instances in the last few months of where government in this country has been overreaching in certain states in literally restricting church gatherings. I'm thankful that we're in a state that sees the church as an essential service, but that is not true in every state. And so there are some legal battles that are going on because of a clear government overreach, and I suspect that that whole situation is going to escalate, and perhaps in a very big way. And so in the midst of this kind of a situation, many of us turn to the words of Peter and John in Acts chapter 5, verse 29, which is a clarion call that we must obey God rather than men. If a choice is to be made, and in some states choices must be made, the choice is abundantly clear for the people of God. If you call us to obey you as our government leader, in contradiction to what God would have us to do, the line is drawn. We must obey God rather than men. Such was the case with Moses' parents. They were guilty of civil disobedience, and we can certainly be very, very thankful for that. So verse 24, our attention turns now to Moses himself. And it says, by faith. There's that phrase that we see all throughout. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Notice this phrase, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Came a time in Moses' adult life when he had that first faith milestone, that first moment when he had to truly stand strong in faith. I think that faith decision was influenced by the faith, first of all, of his parents. Again, the unsung heroes, but the legacy of faith of his parents no doubt impacted him. So when that time came, he took a bold step of faith. He took the important step of faith to reject the privilege of his adopted royal family, because he had been taken in by Pharaoh's daughter, rescued literally from death, taken in by Pharaoh's daughter and raised with all the privileges and the riches that the Egyptian government offered to him. There came that time, it says, when he chose to reject that privilege to identify with his oppressed true family, the Israelites. In faith, he chose ill treatment over royal privilege. A few months ago, we heard about Harry and Meghan that decided they were going to forego their position with the British royal family to go elsewhere and to live life on their own terms. Now that's about as far as the comparison goes with Moses, because it does not appear like Moses they chose any ill treatment. Sounds like they got a pretty comfortable, good life. But they nevertheless gave up some significant benefits of the royal family. That's a little sampling of what it was that Moses gave up by turning away from the privilege of Egypt and identifying with his true family. The motivation for his choice I find absolutely fascinating when I look at a phrase in this verse that I had not really noticed before. Look again where it says that he considered, reading out of another translation, he considered the reproach because of the Messiah to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, since his attention was on the reward. The Messiah, who wasn't to be born for quite a long time after the time of Moses, but we get this sense that there was much known about the Messiah. We know that Abraham, it says, had the gospel preached to him ahead of time, and Abraham understood about the Messiah. And obviously Moses did as well, and what a tremendous step of faith that when he considered all that he had available in Egypt, to make that bold choice. I would rather identify with the people of God, and literally the reproach of the Christ, the Messiah, which I think indicates he knew something of the suffering of God's Son eventually, that he chose to cast his lot with the people of God and the Messiah of God because he had his eyes on the future reward. He took the long view, and that's the thing that mattered much more to him. Verse 27 tells us that by faith he left Egypt behind, not being afraid of the king's anger. That probably refers to the Exodus, where not only did he leave Egypt, he took all the Israelites, the slave labor, with him. He was not afraid of the king's anger, of the king's decree. And to me that sounds just a little bit like a lesson from his parents' faith, that we're not afraid of the king's decree. And Moses had learned that to do the right thing, to do God's will, mattered more than the anger of the authorities. And so he was not afraid of the king or his laws or his force or whatever he could do. He wanted to go out. He wanted to do that which God called him to do. And it says, for Moses persevered, verse 27, as one who sees him who is invisible. Another very intriguing phrase. He continued on because he had his eyes on the one who could not be seen in any other way except faith. Another great milestone. In faith, he saw the invisible Holy One, the God of Israel, the creator of the universe. And so he was willing to press on and to move on because of him. And so when it says that he saw the one who is invisible, that takes me back to the very first verse of Hebrews 11. And the great definition of faith that we see there. Now, faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen. I come back to this time and again, but it appears to me, especially out of Hebrews 11, that faith puts on some glasses upon the individuals who have it. Faith puts on glasses that allows us to see what otherwise would be unseen. So picture putting on a pair of glasses that allow you to, in fact, I think the best illustration is night vision goggles. Militaries develop that. If you know anything about it, night vision goggles are very important to soldiers out on the battlefield. It allows them to see what would be hidden in the darkness, to see what is clearly evident in the light. And I think it's a pretty good illustration of faith. Faith allows us to see that which cannot be seen in any other way. And so Moses, among others, put on those glasses of faith that allowed him to see. Verse 28 says that by faith he instituted the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch the Israelites. This kind of calls to my mind a saying you probably have heard, that what goes around comes around. I go back to the beginning of Moses' life. Born as a baby boy, where the law said that all the Israeli baby boys were to be put to death. And of course we know Moses was spared. We think then later on as an adult, Moses and the plagues of God poured out through him. The very last one was the killing of the firstborn of all the people throughout the land. Pharaoh was not exempted. The firstborn in his house died at the hand of God through that plague. What goes around comes around. He experienced some of that pain himself. And so that final plague that was poured out, that impacted literally every family in Egypt. But we think of the Passover and what a significant thing that was, where a faith step that involved taking an unblemished lamb and smearing its blood on the lintel and the two doorposts of the house would spare death, the angel of death, from visiting that household. God himself says in Exodus 12, verse 13, "When I see the blood, I will pass over you. No plague will be among you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." It is called Passover because the angel of death would pass over when he would see the blood of the lamb. We see that as a great shadow of something much more important extending on down to us. What God has done for us through the blood of his Son, where that blood that is covered over us allows the angel of death to pass over us so that we can experience the hope of eternal life, resurrection life. And so we see how very important that is. And of course, this morning, this being a Communion Sunday, we will focus even more upon that significance of Passover. Verse 29, the last verse here talking about Moses, talks about the fact that by faith, Moses and the Israelites passed very safely through the Red Sea while the pursuing Egyptian army was drowned. And also, what a great faith milestone. What a great act of faith to believe that God would do that he would part the Red Sea, providing dry land for safe passage. Another significant time of great faith with Moses and the people of God. So we take a look at this portrait of Moses on the wall of faith. There's some pretty important faith lessons to be learned from him, as we've been learning from each one that we look at each week. The first lesson that seems obvious to me and important is that faith risks consequences. We see that on the part of Moses' parents and Moses himself. And I think faith reminds us of the great truth that we find in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7, that says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fearfulness, but one of power, love, and sound judgment." Faith risks consequences. We lift that up because it sure seems like fear is dominating the lives of a lot of people today, and maybe to some degree us. We understand that a dangerous virus is on the loose. It has been for several months at least. But we need to keep the whole thing in perspective. For one thing, we understand that the percentage chance of contracting that virus are very, very low. We also understand there are certain safety measures that are wise, that are helpful. But beyond that, and I think this is an important point to consider in terms of faith, beyond that, God through Christ supplies strength and help. And it takes faith to believe that we ought to have faith, to have courage, and to not be cowering in a corner in fear, because I suspect many people are doing that, and we dare not do that. We need to make sure that we are guided by faith in the presence and the protection of our God and our Savior, Jesus Christ, because our faith must be greater than the fear of what could happen to us. That is not befitting of the people of God. Taking another look at that portrait of Moses, we learn that faith foregoes present benefits for future blessings. That's what Moses did. He cast his lot not with the privileges of the royal family, but with the oppressed people of God and the suffering of the Messiah that he saw in faith concerning the future. So Moses gave up great privilege and status to identify with his oppressed people and the Messiah, and thus Moses took the long view of things. Being comfortable is very appealing to us in life, but comfort is not the goal of faith. Faith makes us uncomfortable much of the time. Faith asks questions like, what is the next great faith adventure in my life? What is God through Christ calling me to do that is so big that if they are not in it, it will fail? And I'm finding myself needing to revisit those questions because I suspect that I've become too comfortable in my life lately as well. But I think that faith dares to ask those kinds of questions. What is it, God, that will stretch me just a bit more? What is it that will take me out of the comfort zone and make me uncomfortable? And what is it that you would have me partner with you in that is so big that if you're not in that, I'm going to fall flat on my face? I believe that faith calls us to consider those kinds of things. Another thing about faith is that faith is built on one decision at a time. We know that faith starts with the step of accepting Jesus as our Savior and Lord. And we take the step of water baptism. But from there, it is one faith milestone after another. What's next, God? What's the next adventure of faith that you have? And so we take one faith decision at a time as we go forward. And a faith step can be a venture into some area of service that we're really not very comfortable with. Like maybe responding to a request to teach a class, maybe those little kids especially. I've never done that before, and I'm not sure I want to do that, but I believe you're calling me to do that. Or perhaps that one step is to witness to a neighbor or to a family member, to dare to share the gospel, not knowing how they're going to respond to it. Or perhaps that one next step is a call to a short-term mission work or ministry work. Or it might involve risking a financial gift to help a ministry. It might even go so far as to risk moving to a new area because God has called you to go to that particular area. Faith is building upon one decision at a time. And you know, faith is not just about doing, and I want to make sure I'm clear on this. I don't want you to misunderstand. Faith and works go hand in hand, absolutely. The book of James reminds us of that time and time again. But faith, first of all, is the focus of our thinking before it can ever be a doing in our lives. Faith begins with a focus, and then it's followed up by action. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 18 says, "We do not focus on what is seen, but on what is unseen, for what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal." There again, we put on the glasses of faith, and we take a look at the God of possibilities who cannot be seen with the naked eye. We focus upon that great God of possibilities. We focus our thinking before the actions follow through, but we must have a faith focus to begin with. I think that's exactly what Jesus had in mind in Matthew chapter 6, the Sermon on the Mount, when we find here the priority of faith thinking in his words. Because he says things like in Matthew chapter 6, verse 25, don't worry about food and drink and clothing. He says, I want you to consider this. To paraphrase his words, isn't life more important than food and clothing? It's a searching, challenging question. I want you to think about this. I want you to focus your faith in thinking about the fact that life is more important than those things. He says in verse 26 of Matthew 6, he says, look at the birds of the air. And I think it's not just a glancing view of the birds. He says, I want you to take a close look. I want you to see how God provides. I want you to focus faith on what God is doing to provide for the birds of the air. He says something similar in verse 28. He says, I want you to observe how the lilies of the field grow. To observe is to carefully look under the microscope. I want you to look closely at how God is providing in that area. I want you to do those things. Focus your faith, observe and study and think about so you can develop a faith mentality as to how God provides, and that prepares you for those steps of action that follow from there. Faith begins with a focus of our thinking. So it's important that we think about, we focus on our faith legacy, to look backwards, so to speak. To take a look at those times in the past, at how God has provided for us. And I can guarantee you every believer has a legacy of faith. God has provided for you many, many times. You may not be observing and aware, but to really focus your attention, you'll know that God has provided in the past, which sets the precedent to know that in faith He will do so in the future. He will guide you in those steps, those things He's calling you to, because He has provided for you in the past. I was thinking about a few instances in my own life when I know God has provided. I think about a time, I can still picture this scene in my mind. A time when I was driving down an icy road. My car skidded out of control as I was trying to pass an 18-wheel truck, which was pretty stupid. And I can still see my car fishtailing back and forth, just ready to go underneath the trailer of that truck. To this day, I don't know how I got out of it, but God got me out of it. I know that He saved me and He provided for me. There were times early in our ministry, Jill knows this as well as I do, when we were on the brink financially. We were out of resources because there weren't very many to start with. All we had was a measure of faith that God would get us through. And He did. And He's done it numerous times. God has provided. I also know there were a couple of times when I was in pretty serious emotional and mental trouble, about ready to go under. And I know that God saved me from going over the edge. That's just a little bit of my story, and I know you all have one as well. I was thinking a good practical thing for us to do as a faith stretching exercise would be to take a piece of paper and to draw a line across and to mark out on that line all those special times when you know that faith was the overriding factor. To look back at your legacy of faith, I know will stir up your faith to a greater measure, to live more by faith today and in the future. So with that said, I go back to that thought once again, that faith is built on one decision at a time. And I want to conclude by asking you this question this morning. What faith decision are you called to make today?